Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our reflections on the spending review, which happened yesterday. I'm delighted to be able to have a conversation with Andy Pike, Professor at Newcastle University, who specialises in local government and finance, and Jeff Matsu, he is CIPFA's Chief Economist. What we're going to do today is just have a consideration of the thoughts from our panel on Rachel Reeves' announcements yesterday, what that might mean for the public sector and what the future might hold. So a very warm welcome, and thank you both Andy and Jeff for giving up your time to spend with us, and hopefully over the next half an hour or so we'll be able to gather your reflections on those announcements, what she said, and what you think how that will impact both local government but also the wider public sector, because as we saw, the announcements were quite different dependent on which part of the public sector you were in. If you were to do with defence, you did quite well. Housing also did well, but perhaps some of the other areas not so much money coming our way. But thank you very much for spending some time. So I suppose opening comment really, and question to you, Andy, is you've experienced several spending reviews over the last years. So I wondered what your initial impressions were of Rachel Reeves yesterday and her announcements.
Yeah, well, thanks, Joe, for the invitation to contribute. It's crucial that CIPFA convenes these sorts of discussions to try and really get some analysis and reflection on what is a critical spending review then for the government in terms of setting out their plans for the next 3 and 4 years. I think overall, there was some relief yesterday from a local government perspective that there was actually some positive news. There was a lot of coverage preceding the spending review that were trailing the very difficult political and economic context, the poly-crisis, tight public finances, and an expected squeeze then on what we thought might be an unprotected department in MHCLG, and with an emphasis then on health and defence spending. And it didn't help, I think, by some of the coverage saying that MHCLG was very late. I think probably the second last to the Home Office to actually settle with the Treasury 3 days before the full announcement, which suggested a kind of protracted, tough negotiations going on reportedly about affordable housing, homelessness, local council funding and regional growth funds. So core things for local government. And I think overall then, just at that high level, I think the spending review really reflected some recognition then of local government's integral role then in what Labour's trying to do in terms of their manifesto commitments and national missions, particularly the 39 billion quid then over 10 years on affordable and social housing, linking to the house building targets the government's set itself. So while there were some welcome elements, I think the scale and scope of the additional funding doesn't really go far enough, and certainly falls a bit short of the Chancellor's claim then of putting local government finances then on a sustainable footing.
Thank you, Andy. Yes, certainly. It's always interesting, isn't it? Because what's trailed, you've got to start to sort of identify what are the clues and what are the facts from the fiction. So certainly the case.
Certainly.
So Jeff, we've heard of Andy's impressions from yesterday. So listening to it as an economist, what were your takeaways?
Thanks, Joe. I think it was a positive step forward for both Rachel Reeves and Labour generally in changing the narrative of one from tax that came from the tax rise announcements that came in the previous 2 fiscal events in the spring and autumn. There was a lot of weight on her shoulders. Her popularity has really plummeted over the past intervening period. And this was an opportunity for her to really champion the growth missions, the plan for change that Labour has been resting its government on. And I think she did a fairly good job in changing that mood and that narrative into something that was more positive and upbeat, namely because this was a spending review and she didn't have the weight of the OBR's fiscal and economic forecast to contend with. That will come to, of course, will come to challenge her come the autumn. But the narrative itself she gave was one that aren't we aren't having a redux of austerity, that there is on the ground delivery through things like free school meals and all of this raft of transport projects. But one thing that sort of still remains elusive is that coherent vision for growth and improving living standards. All of these things will not be directly helped by the large-scale capital spending. And on the economic front, whilst Q1 GDP growth was stronger than expected, the latest fresh estimates of April monthly GDP, actually, the initial estimate is that it fell 0.3% for the month. So we're not out of the woods just because you announce all of these spending things that are on longer term projects. And long-term yields still remain quite elevated. So these are all challenges that she faces. So kind of saying, there's lots of spending going on and that I'm going to stay within the spending envelope that was announced in the last spending announcement, that's all fine. But it takes years for some of these capital spending projects to manifest and yield dividends. And in the interim, I think people will feel the pain of sort of some of the public services that are going to be crimped, particularly around some of the local services that they get in local communities.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, that wasn't, bearing in mind an economist, that actually wasn't too pessimistic for an outlay. So, thank you. Yes, I suppose a follow-up question to that for both of you, as just to sort of reflect on. So Labour have now, after their landslide victory last year, they've been in power for a year. I mean, it's been quite a challenging year. I think they, they've certainly had their fair share of ups and downs. So I wonder, do you think that the priorities for this spending review allocation will support the missions that Labour has set themselves? Or do you think sort of a year on, actually those initial missions have been overtaken by other things? So how do you think they'll sort of use this spending review to set out some of those long-term ambitions? Shall I start with Andy for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's always heartening to hear Jeff, who really demonstrates that economists don't have to be dismal scientists every time. But he's certainly right to point that to this idea that I think Rachel Reeves was trying to articulate around national renewal as a vision and narrative, if you like, to try and sort of get government back on track through these spending announcements. And of course, that's a capacious category, national renewal, which allows lots of things to be kind of stacked up underneath it. But that's clearly what Rachel Reeves as Chancellor is attempting to do. And I think, as you say, Joe, that this first year has been tumultuous in many ways for a Labour government returning to power. Disruption, volatility, uncertainty, this kind of intensifying idea of poly-crisis, connected, interlocking kind of events that have been difficult to deal with. So I think any government in any country now, whatever plans for change, missions, aims, goals they've got, has been kind of buffeted by those external events. And certainly in Labour's case, then it's 5 missions, this cross-cutting kind of agenda for government. They've had to shoehorn defence into that kind of picture, really, which of course wasn't one of the sort of key 5 missions, and try and work that, I guess, across perhaps the idea of connecting it to economic growth and investment type initiatives. So that's been tough. I think that the interesting thing in terms of the extent to which local government can connect and contribute, I think, on those missions has really been sort of threaded through the spending review. I mean, certainly that relatively more positive news for local government then on the capital expenditure side, and just quite right, as many commentators have, to point to the The caveat that these take a bit of time, obviously, to deliver tangible outcomes that can actually be seen and felt on the ground. But there's certainly some really substantive things there. As you mentioned at the top of this, Joe, the 39 billion quid over 10 years for affordable and social housing. I mean, that's really substantive. The other things there on the further 10 billion quid and making Homes England into this public financial institution, which is a really interesting kind of institutional change, trying to get it to act more as a housing bank, providing lower cost finance to house builders, unlocking these larger scale developments, trying to attract and crowd in the jargon, private investment. The infrastructure projects, particularly with the emphasis of being outside London and the greater southeast as well, the 15 billion pounds there. And then interestingly as well, the 20 million pound then for these 350 rather trailblazing neighbourhoods as well, which relatively small beer in overall spending terms and welcome, but and interesting in terms of whether that's the kind of stuff that money that should have gone to local government anyway, really, to kind of do these sorts of initiatives. And then the rather elliptical reference then to this growth mission fund then that we'll need to sort of see the detail on that. So I think overall it kind of reflects the recognition that local government's integral to the plan and the missions, and it hasn't been sort of fully unprotected and facing real term cuts like some other departments, as Jeff mentioned, their Home Office, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Department of Culture, Media and Sport as well, which have, as you say, experienced much more of a squeeze from this set of announcements.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean it is interesting when when we see that growth in defence, isn't it? And that it was her speech did link it very much with sort of that economic growth as she was talking about the creation of jobs and things, which is is an interesting dynamic for a particular spending area that hasn't previously had that growth. So Jeff, can I sort of put that question to you again about whether you think that election victory after 3 years and how this spending review supports the growth? I know you've got you've done a lot of work in regional growth in the past.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think there's been a pivot or maybe a more focus away from the 5 broad missions that was laid out in the Labour manifesto towards 3 pillars or priorities around economic growth, health, and security. And so a lot of the announcements we heard yesterday in terms of how spending is going to be allocated across the budgets really kind of coalesced around those 3 pillars or priorities. And Starmer, after the event, even articulated that this is the new stage in the mission of national renewal. And so the mission's framework is very much alive and thriving, but these pillars are really focused around those 3 key areas. And we saw a lot of spending being allocated towards the sort of the net zero and sustainability piece of the puzzle, and that's sort of been tied together with defense spending, sort of as one mission or pillar, if you want to call it that. But other areas like local communities, the Safer Streets, for example, mission, and opportunities for all, some of those were all vague and a bit loosey-goosey, and those seem to have received less attention in yesterday's announcements. But that plan for change, the manifesto that Labour originally articulated, really did guide sort of how Rachel Reeves allocated funding yesterday. As I said, there was a lot of funding to support connectivity across places, and so there seemed to be a second wind of sort of the leveling up. There obviously isn't going to be an utterance of that phrase, but we had a lot more investment in infrastructure and transportation, particularly at a regional and local scale, and that is welcome to hear, and that supports sort of this need to bring in those left behind places. And so a lot rests in next week's or the anticipated release of the infrastructure strategy next week. Remains to be seen what comes out of the delayed industrial strategy and how these frameworks that the government announces through these white papers will crowd in private investment is really, really important to make sure that these missions are pillars in how growth is going to be cast across the country in an inclusive way, actually gets the funding it needs, because yesterday's funding in and of itself won't be sufficient to tackle a decade or more of decay that we've kind of seen in sort of our physical infrastructure, whether it's in transportation or across public services, such as in the prisons estate or in hospitals, whether it's building or IT infrastructure. All of that requires a lot of money and expertise that the private sector really excels in. And, she mentioned AI, for example. That, if it's going to thread through these missions, really needs the private expertise and funding to kind of join forces with public capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you make a good point about AI. Often that's sort of seen as that increase in productivity, which has been really quite elusive in a lot of the public sector. So it's about trying to harness that. I've got a sort of couple of questions, and I might come back to you, Jeff, before going to Andy. It's about so whether you anticipate, and you've sort of started, I suppose, in the response to that earlier question, how you anticipate that these spending reviews decisions will impact on the wider public sector. I suppose, could you pick out maybe one specific area from yesterday that you will think will have the most impact on that broader public sector development or growth from yesterday? Is there anything that particularly stands out?
I think the fact that the Chancellor focused on the Green Book and how funding of large-scale projects will be assessed across a renewed, revisited Green Book framework is welcome. The Office for Value for Money has sort of stepped up and published departmental efficiency plans for the first time. And that is actually quite welcome, because in the past, there used to be this narrative of, we'll hit this target from efficiency savings, but there was no detailed plan or idea as to how government intended to achieve that. The Office for Value for Money actually articulates in its publication how departments plan to achieve that 1% efficiency saving over the coming years, and outlines where it hopes to find, that almost 14 billion in annual savings by the end of the Parliament. I mentioned briefly about part of that value and getting this efficiency savings coming through the system is through public sector productivity uplift and using AI. But just saying AI is going to bring these efficiency gains isn't sufficient. It's necessary, of course, but it's not sufficient. So there needs to be proof in delivery of how AI and other technologies and innovations are going to be rolled out, particularly in challenging areas like procurement, which takes a lot of public spending, but is very much in another era, like with the dinosaurs. And so that would be my key point around assessing for value, getting those efficiency gains fed through to public services, and making sure that there's that implementation.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Jeff. No, I think that's true. Well, I've given you a little bit more time to think, Andy. So I'm now gonna sort of put the very similar question to you about how you anticipate those spending review decisions will impact the sort of. I was going to be a bit focused on local government, and maybe if you've got some thoughts, I'm interested to tease out what you think about the housing boost, because that I think that often is at the crux of a lot of conversations we have about local government.
Yeah, certainly. As I said at the start, the real sort of turnaround from the fear that local government would be, and MHCLG would be an unprotected department facing a squeeze, it's actually ended up with this relatively more positive news, albeit from a very kind of modest set of expectations. I mean, overall, the core spending power, I think, is set to increase by something like 2.6% in real terms then, between 2025 and 26 and 2028, 29. So that's key. I mean, that of course assumes that council tax increases will stick at 5% a year. I think we've kind of recognised that in recent financial situations. I mean, the key thing, I suppose, is that this is only really going some way to replenishing the funds that have been sort of taken out of the system, certainly in that early part of the kind of austerity decade, certainly between 2010, 2015, where you had that kind of big 25% odd cut in core spending power. So it's been ebbing back up, if you like, to sort of replenish the funds available to local councils, but from a very diminished base, if you like. So that's key. I think two of the big areas, I mean, you mentioned the housing one is obviously a big thing on the capital side, to really hope local authorities to do more on the affordable social housing side, which you hope will be very positive. Again, could be more, could help go further and faster in terms of meeting that sort of national target. I think the other key areas as well, given the sort of acute statutory service pressures local government is facing, was the additional funds. Firstly, I think there was 555 million odd quid transformation funding there for the children's social care stuff then. And interestingly, that's a joint thing then with MHCLG and the Department for Education, which is really quite important, because obviously a lot of local government's financial predicament is very, very closely linked to what's going on in other Whitehall departments. And I think as well, the promise then of 760 odd million quid then for the special educational needs and disabilities services as well, which is again a very important thing. Again, the worry is, I'm sure, in the sector that it's still short of what's needed to fund the pressures in those services. The capital expenditure stuff we've mentioned, then the other stuff on roads, railways, green energy, other infrastructure things is obviously going to be helpful. The connection as well to an explicit recognition that the national renewal stuff is not just about London and the greater southeast. It's that as well, but it's not just that, which is really important, I think, in terms of stimulating growth across the country. So Liverpool to Manchester rail line is a big headline there, catching one, revisions to the Green Book that Jeff's mentioned. And I think as well, it's not a return to austerity for sure. It's a modest kind of set of additions to funding, although it's quite front loaded, I think, with the capital budgets. The last 2 years, I think, towards the Parliament will be rather less, depending on what happens in terms of fiscal policy and tax increases later in the year. So overall, I think, again, it's recognition, I think, of local government's importance in terms of the national government's goals. Its closeness to people's everyday lives, relatively more trusted status. The idea of trying at least to go some way towards fixing its finances then and make it more of a partner in terms of delivering on this tangible change then that national government is seeking.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks, Andy. I think you make a good point. Certainly to anybody listening who's in local government, the children's social care and the SEND is certainly sort of front and foremost of some of the challenges that they're facing with their financial sustainability. Also interesting, you're talking about, and one of the things that struck me from the spending review is that there was quite a lot of it was based then on further development. So Jeff, you were talking about, you're waiting for the industrial strategy, and you're talking about, we're waiting for the consultation on funding reform, obviously also the Casey review. So there's still quite a lot of stuff that is going to come out as that transition and consultation come to bear. So Jeff, coming back to you then, I mean, you've done quite a bit over the years on evaluation, probably also sort of peaked as well with that Green Book. I mean, how do you think that the success of this spending review could be evaluated if we were to look back, let's say, have this conversation in a year's time? What do you think? How do you think it will be evaluated and judged?
Yeah, before I come to that that question, I just quickly wanted to reflect on that point Andy just made about that spending profile, and how a lot of the spending was front loaded, and we knew that from what was announced in the spring statement. And what's critical here is that because a lot of the announced spending, over 100 billion in capital spending, a lot of those transport projects, as we know, the funding extends beyond into the next parliament, and we know that a lot of that can just be cut. And so that's the risk here, right? That when you have these long funding projects, government of whatever stripes have a history of delaying, reviewing, pausing, or canceling some of these things to find savings closer to the time where they really have to make sort of the budget balance, so to speak. But coming to your question about around evaluation, I think that there's 4 key areas. One is around making sure that investment is targeted. So, for example, if one of the missions is looking around making sure that economic growth kind of reaches places that might be left behind and deprived, making sure that you track these things through a structured framework, making sure you define the metrics that you are going to be targeting at the design stage of both projects, but also then funding, and making sure you do it as part of a life cycle of evaluation rather than just something that's at the beginning to get funding and at the end when a project is completed. There needs to be course correction that's more periodic for there to be effective use of public funding. The second area would be around data-driven policy making. So making sure that, as I said, we have dashboards, we being like policymakers and those within the public sector, so that they can gauge and track regional performance and the impact that public spending is having on a more timely basis. The third area would be a focus on long-term outcomes. This is something that we didn't quite see yesterday. We still saw a lot of the allocations across departments being quite siloed. There really is a need for budgets to kind of be joined up with shared outcomes to incentivize collaboration. We haven't seen that yet, but there is that need to be laser focused on long-term outcomes when you're spending these sums of money and doing that amount of borrowing. Because yesterday, obviously, the Chancellor did not mention the fact that all of this spending comes with, a lot of borrowing that needs to be paid back. So if that strategy doesn't work, there'll be reckoning at the end of it. And fourth and finally is to strengthen accountability mechanisms. And so there needs to be, through data and more frequent monitoring frameworks, clear accountability frameworks, not just for central government, but also tying what central government is trying to do and how it's cascading funding down to the regions and local authorities, how it's managing that funding flow and achieving milestones in its growth objectives. All of this needs to be evidenced through these monitoring and evaluation frameworks to strengthen that accountability that government has across all of these tiers. It can't just be at central government because we're highly centralized. No, it has to be across all 3. There needs to be a culture of peer learning that is developed across the UK. Right now, there isn't that much of a peer learning ethos, and that's largely due to how funding is disseminated across the country. So more stringent data collection and evaluation mechanisms, better benchmarking to allow places at local and regional levels to understand what works and what doesn't, and just developing that culture of shared learning, I think, will be really, really critical.
Thanks, Jeff. No, that's there's some just really useful points at that point. So just sort of building on the stuff that you've said, Andy, I'm going to come to you now. A couple of months ago, you and I met at the Select Committee, and you were talking to them and voicing what you had learned with the work and research that you've done, the extensive work and research that you've done. In fact, I understand you're currently doing a book as well, haven't you? Another book on local government, which will be really excellent. So I just wondered if thinking about that conversation that you had at the select committee about financial sustainability, having heard this spending review and looking ahead, do you think that some of your answers would be different? Would you feel more confident, or would you be standing there saying, no, it's the same thing, and we haven't changed the dial?
Yeah, I think yesterday has gone some way, sort of steps towards beginning to sort of fix some of local government's deep-seated financial problems, some of the dysfunctions in the system, as well as the kind of big issue about the overall quantum of funding that's actually allocated to local government, and crucially that local government can raise itself. But it's some way short, I think, of this claim that it's sort of pushing local government then towards a more sustainable financial footing. I think it's steps towards, and welcome steps towards, but not really kind of moving as far and perhaps as fast as it could or should do. Local government is still facing financial pressure and even distress in some cases then of unprecedented scale and scope. As we mentioned earlier, that legacy of austerity and the funding reductions then from that 2010, 2015, 16 period then really drained the sector of resources and capacity, which have really only been very slowly and partially kind of replenished then in the years since, up to COVID, around COVID, past COVID then, and in the kind of the last few years. So I think it helps in terms of increasing funding, however, modestly. It's whether, and I think we see this in the National Audit Office recent report on latest report on local government financial sustainability, then that the funding can be increasing, but the rises in population, service demand and complexity, the provision costs with inflation that are still outstripping local government's capacity then to be able to deliver on these statutory responsibilities, and particularly those in the very difficult areas then of adult and children's social care, special educational needs and disabilities, and temporary accommodation, all of which have been touched upon in the spending review in terms of some capital projects and some specific kind of programs to help. And as we've seen, the intensifying financial pressures. I mean, we've got, I think, in NAO sort of something like 42, that's just over 10% of the total 317 local governments in England then have needed exceptional financial support to balance their budgets. We've got seven, I think, local governments having issued Section 114 notices. So the idea that they can't balance their budget since 2018. And that's the subject of the book that we're doing with Mia Gray at Cambridge at the moment. And in terms of what LGA estimate as being the funding gap, I mean, they would argue that by 2028, 29, the funding gap's going to be about 8 billion quid. Now, yesterday's announcements only goes a tiny way towards closing that funding gap in terms of addressing those structural issues then between, in the jargon, unfunded mandates, that we've got legal responsibilities that we're asking local government to deliver, but insufficient funding for them to do it. So this is a real structural problem that, again, yesterday's announcements only go some way towards trying to fix. What's interesting, again, NAO make a really good point on this, is that the financial issues and structural problems that local government face then are not their own. They're very much about how they interrelate with some other big ticket, big budget departments like health and social care, and how that social care will be kind of funded and dealt with, and the need for, as Jeff mentioned there, these sort of more collaborative working, more integrated, more whole of government type approaches then, which, arguably that mission approach was meant to kind of encourage really in terms of cross departmental working, getting beyond the silos, beyond the departmentalism of that we know so well from Whitehall and our very centralised system. And this MHCLG DFE program then around children's social care, might be a good sign, if you like, even though it's only a kind of bilateral program between two departments to try and address some of these bigger structural issues.
Yeah, no, that's you make a really good point. I think that that making sure that that central government are also talking to themselves, within those departments about some of these issues becomes really important, because they're not individual silos. They can't just be sorted out by one specific group. So I think that's a really, really important point. So, I mean, thank you very, very much for your contributions. It's been fascinating, and I really appreciate it, because obviously you've only had a very short period of time to look at the spending review. I sort of, in the last couple of minutes, can I come back to you, Jeff, for sort of any final reflections, and then Andy, I'll sort of come back to you. Is there anything, Jeff, that you've thought, no, we haven't covered that, or just to sort of signpost any of our listeners to something that they, looking through the document, they might go, oh, page 74, that's a good one. Not that I don't quote me on page 74.
My final reflection would be just looking ahead as to how this connects with the longer term strategy, because obviously the chancellor was focused on longer term spending through her 100 billion plus of capital spending. So the big question for me and for many others will be, will this chunky amount of extra spending in infrastructure, for example, bring sufficient benefits and economic growth to make the 140 billion of extra borrowing worthwhile? That's a really critical question that both the chancellor and the prime minister, they will need to face that judgment, because if this investment doesn't materialize in picking up growth and productivity, it very much isn't a positive thing. So there will be a summer of speculation between today and the autumn budget, and what will be on many people's minds, including the financial markets in particular, will be how taxes will play into this picture, and that will be announced in the autumn budget. So all of this needs to tie into that long-term decision-making mindset, and making sure that spending is looked alongside borrowing costs, and that there are external events as well, and this isn't just a UK story, and so we can't just bring in the risk of external events to explain when things go poorly. This is a very uncertain world we live in. There's a lot of trade disputes going on at the moment, rising global borrowing costs. So the chancellor is very much exposed to a raft of risks leading into her autumn budget. And so she does need to, I think she's done well in this spending review in terms of communicating a more positive narrative, the road is very fraught with risks that she will need to overcome in a few months' time.
No, that's lovely. Yeah, a summer of speculation. There we go. I think that will be a quote for someone. We'll definitely be using that one. And Andy, your sort of final thoughts on anything that you think you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, on the macro stuff, as Jeff rightly summarizes, that in a sense this is a kind of Keynesian strategy for uncertain times. The idea of borrowing to try and invest in the sort of growth enhancing infrastructure to try and kickstart the economy, get the growth coming and the tax receipts coming in to try and balance the books at the national level. So that's risky, obviously in an era of polycrisis, but it does beg the question: what on earth would you do differently for any national kind of treasury and national government? I think most around the world are scratching their heads in terms of how do you navigate and find a way through for your national economy and public finances in the current context. I think on the local government side of things, I mean, clearly the devil will be in the detail in terms of the savings and delivery, in terms of how the capital projects and the kind of increased money is dealt with. There are some very interesting points made in the documents then about an updated need assessment, which is really going to be important in terms of addressing areas of deprivation. There's also some hints then around funding consolidation, so trying to simplify, trying to give local authorities this greater flexibility to innovate, so almost allowing local authorities in our very centralized system a bit more scope to actually do what they deem appropriate as democratically elected tiers of government at the local level to address their local needs and potentials and residents' ambitions. So that's going to be important. But I think ultimately it will come back to this idea that, okay, this has helped and it steps towards putting local government on a sustainable footing in terms of its finances. But there's a long journey and many more steps to go. And as Jeff indicates, and as you say yourself, Joe, the further speculation then about whether the Chancellor's very narrow kind of headroom for manoeuvre will lead to likely tax increases then of whichever kind then come the autumn 2025 budget, which a lot of the commentariat seem to suggest is a nailed on prospect.
Thank you. Well, thank you both for a fantastic conversation. It's been really, really great. And it's always really interesting, isn't it, when you lift up the lid of some of these things like the spending review and start to unpick some of those. You know, there are areas where you think, yes, that's fantastic, and I know that and other areas where, you know, we raise concerns, and I think that's you've done that both really well. So I appreciate that for your expertise and your insight. Just leaves me to say thank you very, very much for your time. I'm already thinking I'll book you both for after the autumn budget, because we'll do this again, and see perhaps what's happened as a result of the spending review, and then what we've got in that next fiscal event. But in the meantime, I hope you both enjoy your summer. And that looking very much forward to the book. Andy, when is that coming out?
We've got to write it first, Joe, but yes, it's
right.
work in process, work in progress. Yeah.
Okay. And Jeff as well, and the work you're doing on regional growth. So thank you both very much, and I wish you a very pleasant rest of the day. So thank you very much. My name's Joanne Pitt. I'm the Senior Policy Manager here at CIPFA. So please do drop us a line or visit our website if you want anything else, follow up on the spending review or public sector. Thank you very much and have a good day.